I wanted to thank everybody for joining this morning. We understand that this is an opportunity to get some learning, but it's also taking the time away from your day where you have an opportunity to meet with clients. So we do appreciate this time taken to work with us and learn a little bit more about mortgage fraud and some of the impacts that are on the mortgage brokering. What we want to do is try and get the most for you out of your membership and the sponsorship that we have here. So we do appreciate you taking the time. We hope that you'll get some knowledge out of the wonderful speakers that we have today that have joined us, and look forward to the conversation that occurs. We still see some people jumping in, and I'll go over a couple of housekeeping items in a few minutes. So I think we shall get started now. Thank you again to be joining this wonderful event. What we'll do is speak a little bit about mortgage fraud from a couple of different of our participants here who have some great experience for us. So we'll start with the introductions. So my name is Jeff Brown. My role is Regional Vice President with FCT. I'm also Western Canadian sales leader for our legal professional solutions group with FCT. I'll be the host and the moderator for today's event. We've got two great speakers lined up as well. So as you can see, what we've got here is we've got Veronica Armstrong from Veronica Armstrong Law Corp, and Tony Spagnuolo from Spagnuolo and Company, and myself, Jeff Brown. Great to have both Veronica and Tony joining us today. Veronica is the namesake of the Veronica Armstrong Law Corporation, and Tony is obviously the namesake of the Spagnuolo and Company Corporation. I'm not the namesake of FCT, although I like to say that I am. But I think it's really great that we do have these speakers with us today. As I mentioned earlier on, the great knowledge, great educational component that they can provide to you today. So we do appreciate everybody joining us today. This is an important piece that I'd like to take a couple of minutes to speak on. We couldn't do these type of events without our sponsors, so we really do appreciate the sponsorship that we get. And I'm going to take a couple of minutes to share some of the information on the three sponsors that made today's webinar the opportunity available. So we've got ProLink as the endorsed errors and omissions liability provider for CMBA-BC. ProLink Insurance believes that this webinar on how fraud impacts mortgage brokering is critical. ProLink has been protecting BC mortgage brokers with an industry-leading E&O liability policy for over 15 years. Please visit the Errors and Omissions Liability page under the Membership tab on the CMBA-BC.ca to learn more about ProLink. I want to thank Terranet as well. Purview, which is powered by Terranet, helps mortgage brokers optimize their business with authoritative property data. Learn everything you need to know about a property, neighborhood, and a homeowner all in one place. Purview reports give you access to ownership information, property value, registered mortgages, and other data attributes. And last but certainly not least, VWR Capital. VWR Capital Corp, which was founded in 1993, specializes in urban residential equity-based first and second mortgage financing. VWR generates business through the mortgage broker network in BC through to Ontario, with an asset base of mortgages exceeding 700 million. VWR's niche is a consistent low lender fee structure that saves borrowers money and allows flexibility for brokers to set their own fee, earning what they deserve. We really do appreciate the sponsors for today's event. Thank you very much to ProLink, Terranet, and VWR Capital Corporation. When we talk about membership, this is an important piece, and we're going to get to the meat of the conversation, so I don't want to take a lot of time, but I think it's important to understand that the value of the membership. We often hear those terms. I'm not going to read the slide, but I think it's just important for you to understand what we can do or what you can do by having a membership with CMBA-BC. You can see the price point there, and if you have any information that you want to find out about membership, please go to the CMBA-BC.ca or call the number shown there. But it really is providing these type of sessions is one of the values of the membership of CMBA-BC. And talk a little briefly about some of the upcoming events. And again, as we continue to talk about the value of membership, these are some of the upcoming live events that we've got. We've got the Grow and Connect that's coming up in September. We do have other events as well that go on throughout the course of the year, as shown on the right-hand side. The snapshot sessions are available. The trade show, we all know the value and the impact that we have there, and the marketing panel. So there's a lot of stuff that goes on, and we always look for feedback as well on how we can provide you the best value for your membership. So if there's anything that you'd like to see, please let us know. Here's a couple of the other upcoming webinars that we've got some great value in these webinars as well. You see Rob Mark in the cybersecurity webinar that's coming up on Wednesday, August 14th, starting at 9:30 a.m. And then the market update with Benjamin Tall that's going to be on September 25th, starting at 9 a.m. So a little difference. The other piece I'd like to say here is, again, it's exclusive for CMBA-BC members. So another value of your membership. This is something that you will only get access to if you are a member of CMBA-BC. The other ones that we've got, there's some courses coming up that are very strong for some new brokers or those that want to have a little bit more information about it. We've got a couple of courses that are shown there, the start dates and the sessions that are available, the price point. If there's any questions that you have, you can also reach out to the office and they can give you some more information on the courses that we have available for you. One of the important things before we get into the actual meat of the presentation is the disclaimer. This is something that we like to share, just saying that this isn't legal, financial, or otherwise authoritative advice. It's just information that we want to provide because we think there's value to it, but it can't be used for any legal or financial or authoritative advice. It's just a disclaimer we need to put in. The other big important piece is if you have questions throughout the webinar, please use the Q&A feature. The chat function will not be monitored. So if questions are asked there, we won't be able to get to them. But if you have questions and answers or questions, please put them in the Q&A and we will do our best to get to them as we go through the session. As I'll be the moderator, I will be working with Tony and Veronica and giving them the questions as they come in. So please feel free to use that as the Q&A function. And the last piece on this is, before we get to that, what we'll cover is that there's feedback after the session, and I'll bring it up at the end of the session as well, is that there's a feedback opportunity. That's where, again, we need to gather the information from you on the value of this webinar and what else you'd like to see. So please take a moment. It's about 2 minutes long to get that done, and then we can go from there. So now we're going to start talking about the main event. This is what we're going to cover today. We're going to hear from one of the industry experts with Tony. What does fraud look like, and giving us some examples of that. Then we'll follow it up with Veronica on some compliance requirements, some standard of conduct, and what you can do to be better to meet that standard. And then some of the things that I'll cover are what are some of the things that you can do to proactively protect yourself, and some examples as well. So looking forward to the robust conversation that we'll have, and we are ready to start the presentations off. So Tony, I think I'm going to hand it over to you, sir.
Thanks, Jeff. Thank you, CMBA-BC, for having me on, for putting on this seminar. I think this is an important one. A lot of you may think that mortgage fraud isn't, well, it doesn't happen all that much, but I can assure you it does. And those of us who've been around a while, and those of us that deal with a lot of transactions, have seen it. It's come across our desk, and we've heard an awful lot about it. Thanks to the sponsors, and thanks for all, I think, 86 people who've taken the time to attend the seminar. So there's two types of fraud that we're going to talk about today. First is fraud by shelter. Second is fraud by impersonation. I'm only going to talk about the impersonation. Fraud by shelter is something that the other speaker, Veronica, will chat about. So I want to talk about that. And basically, it involves fake identification, a forged passport, forged driver's license, that kind of stuff. I'm not going to go into the details of how to commit it because I know this thing's being recorded. I don't want to get any bad ideas out there. But the easy properties are those where you have a tenant in a strata building or perhaps an out-of-town owner. And I'll go through some of the stories in a moment and how the fraudsters were able to do what they did. And it usually involves properties like this. I'm not sure about the NOI piece, but I'm going to talk about a TD refi that happened a while ago where I don't know how the heck you prevent that one. So, but we'll get into that. So, and just there's some stats out there about just so you know, the Law Society has put out 2 bulletins, one in 2021, one in 2023, alerting us lawyers. I'm sure the Notary Society has done the same thing. They use forged passports to seal the identity, like I spoke about earlier. They use local management companies. We've seen lots of stories now, lots of examples where they're using fake identification to sell a property they don't even own. They secure mortgage financing, they sell the property, they take the money, they're gone. And the scary part now is, according to Canadian press, organized crime is now discovering that it's a lot easier to commit white collar crime and get away with it than it is almost any other crime. We all know stories of, I won't mention names, of mortgage broker in Victoria or others where nothing's happened. Lawyer fraud back in the 90s, Martin Work and his client, I won't mention his name, hasn't even gone to trial yet. So the stories are real and they're out there. They're real and they're spectacular, in the words of Jerry Seinfeld. So the first kind of batch of stories is more about realtors, but it's about people selling property they don't own. And the first time I came across this was the late 90s, when someone I knew quite well actually sold a property in Deep Cove. Had the fake ID, went to the lawyer's office, got the money transferred to them. So that's more realtor focused. Mortgage brokers aren't dealing with people who are selling properties that they don't own, but you can deal with people who are using fake identification to put a mortgage on property they don't own. And again, there's lots of stories about that. The best one that I know of is, and I don't know how you protect this one. There was let's use my name. Let's say my dad's name is Tony Spags. I live with my dad. Being Italian, of course, I never move out. I have identification that says I'm Tony Spags. I live on Charles Street in North Burnaby. My dad's older. I'm an only child. I figure I don't want to wait for the money. I call up a broker. I put a mortgage on the property. I've got legit ID. My dad knows nothing about it. I'm not on title with my dad. The mortgage gets funded. Sometime later, my dad gets a notice that the mortgage is in default. You know, what happened here? And that's something that you can't really protect against. But it's the most famous one that I know of, where it's, well, I just don't know how to stop that one. But the other ones are easier to stop. And what you want to look for is recent discharges and things like that. Veronica will speak about that. There's other examples where I, again, using my house in Burnaby, I have a mortgage on there with Van City. Let's say the house is worth a couple million. I go and discharge that mortgage. And you don't need to be a lawyer to do that. It's not all that difficult. I won't tell you how, again, because this is being recorded. I then phone up one of our brokers and I say, hey, I just want to put a mortgage on here for a few $100,000, want to put a pool in the backyard, need a new roof, whatever. No problem, it gets done. I still have the Van City mortgage. Now I have a new mortgage. We'll make it up. It's with Scotia. I'm still making payments on those 2 mortgages. I discharged the second mortgage. I put on another one. I could take that $2 million house and probably put on at least $2 million, if not $3 or $4 million worth of mortgages on there. And there are ways to prevent that from happening. There are searches you can do at the land title office. You could do a historical title search, see if there's a recent discharge, that kind of stuff. So that's the kind of stuff that goes on out there. It's more common in private mortgages, which is why almost every private mortgage now, and I shouldn't say private, every MIC mortgage is being scrutinized a bit closer by the title insurance companies, because this is where the growth is really happening. There's also fraud with, you know, all the mortgages, but with the privates in particular, the mom and pop lenders or the MICs, the bigger ones, whether it's today's sponsor or others, they're being held up. And a lot of them now are insisting on ID verification tools, which is something the Law Society has recommended as well. And I wouldn't be surprised if it's going to become mandatory for all segments of the industry, where you have to use, I forget the names of the companies. There's a couple I won't mention, so I don't insult the companies I'm not going to mention, but there's, I think, 6 of them recommended by the Law Society. And we are now using that to verify the client's identification. It's not enough to do a Google search. I recall going to a fraud seminar decades ago, and an RCMP person was on stage, and she showed us how, in literally 3 minutes, they took someone's birthday from the Facebook page and created a whole new identification with credit cards. I don't know how to do that, but it's not that hard to do, apparently. Certainly wasn't 15, 20 years ago. So the ID verification tools are going to become a lot more important. So we're going to talk a bit later about title insurance and protecting and that kind of stuff. But there is a certain degree of due diligence on your part as the broker to screen people, to know where they come from. I've got my inbox here. I haven't looked at my inbox yet, but I was dealing with a realtor this morning who has a client from Hong Kong who wants to buy a $20 million house. It's BS. It's not happening. She's been working with them for a month. There's been no passport coming over. These things come up all the time. So be alert for that. Be aware to that. And get your spidey senses in tune. So I did speak quickly because I only had 6 to 8 minutes to go through this stuff. I could get into specifics on selling property or refinancing property. I'll leave that to the chat feature. But Jeff, how did I do for time?
Well, as usual, Tony, you're bang on. It was perfect for that. I appreciate that. I just had one question of my own on this, Tony. When you talk about the frauds happening, are you seeing it in person? Do you find in your office that it's that they're coming in with a lot more fake IDs, or have you seen any increase in that?
No, our clients don't lie, Jeff. Those aren't we only deal with the honest people. So no, we haven't noticed that at all. But no, we haven't had that personal. We've had other types of more of the fraud for shelter type things. We've had situations where there was a fake appraisal. Of course, we don't even get involved in the appraisal part of it. We had one in Anmore where somehow the appraiser was 800 grand over the value, and they put a mortgage on, took off with it. But so us personally, but I know of other law firms who have. There's lots of stories. If you do a Google search, there's a young lawyer in Ontario who caught someone. I'm pretty sure there's a law firm on West Broadway that caught someone. So it has happened. But as I like to say, our clients don't lie.
Got the most honest client base in all of British Columbia, Tony.
I'm Italian from East Van, of course. I mean, who would ever consider those people to be fraudulent?
I really appreciate the opportunity today, Tony. That's great. Got Tony's contact information here as well if there's any other questions that you may have. I think that, and as you mentioned, Tony, we'll talk about it throughout the rest of the webinar, but we're seeing a considerable increase and a rise in fraud. So it's really around that due diligence for the mortgage broker, making sure that term that's probably overused, but KYC, know your client, take the time to know who they are. It's a very important piece. So I appreciate your time today, Tony, and thank you for taking away from your busy schedule, especially at month end.
Well, thank you. Yeah, we got to work on scheduling for the next few seminars.
Thank you. Veronica, now we're going to turn it over to you.
Thank you very much, Tony. That was very informative. And thank you, Jeff. I would just like to remind everybody that, in fact, anti-money laundering obligations and client identification or client identity verification is going to come into force for the mortgage industry on the 11th of October this year. So it's something that you really do have to be on the lookout for. And Carla has reminded us that for members, the association has actually partnered with Treefort, and that's available to all mortgage brokers for a fee. So you can ask Carla about that later on. So let's get started with our fraud for shelter. And I'm going to tell you a little bit of a story. And the little trick in this one is that, in fact, you are part of the story. So you've met this person, Desmond, and he says he can introduce lots of clients to you, and he just wants some kind of a fee from you. So he suggests that you split your commission with him. And you think to yourself, well, you're new in the business, you really need to start earning income. So you say, okay, let's try it out. And he sends you a client. Now, he sends you a client who is an immigrant from South Korea. Desmond says she was an engineer, but currently she's working as a server at Taco Time. And you might think that this is, well, if you are an immigrant, which many of us are, you probably know that this is a very common scenario. The documents that Desmond sends you shows that she's got $500,000 for a down payment, and she has annual income of $75,000. Okay. So I'll give you a minute to think about that. Do you forward the application to the lender? I'm going to give you 3 scenarios. Of course, these aren't the only ones, but these are the ones that are pertinent to our topic this morning. So in the first scenario, Desmond tells you that he's actually falsified the income on the application and the supporting documents. Well, you send the documents on to the lender thinking, well, you know, they're going to do their due diligence, so I don't have to worry about it. Hang on a minute. This is fraud. Why? Because you have knowingly sent false information to the lender. Fraud is a criminal offense under the criminal code, and I'll talk about that in a little bit more. You also expose yourself to a civil lawsuit where the lender could claim fraudulent misrepresentation. Plus, of course, you're subject to regulatory action by various government agencies, more particularly the BCFSA. And of course, you could suffer reputational damage. Okay, so that's the one worst case scenario. The second one is you decide not to ask any questions, but you're thinking to yourself that, hey, maybe as a server at Taco Time, could I be earning $75,000 a year? It's not impossible, but highly unlikely. In any case, you decide, well, you won't ask any questions, but then you hear from a colleague who's heard that you are dealing with Desmond, and they say to you, Desmond's been known to falsify documents. Well, you don't pursue it any further because after all, that would just land you in a heap of trouble. So you send the documents to the lender. Well, maybe this is not fraud because the prosecution would actually have to prove that you had criminal intent, and they might not be able to do so in this case. But you still expose yourself to a civil lawsuit from the lender claiming either fraudulent or negligent misrepresentation, and you are still subject to regulatory action. And of course, you still would suffer reputational damage. In the third scenario, you don't know that you can ask questions because, hey, what? You're brand new. So you send the documents to the lender. Well, this is probably not fraud because more than likely, the prosecution won't be able to prove criminal intent. But you still expose yourself to the civil lawsuit claiming negligent or even innocent misrepresentation. And even if your misrepresentation was innocent, it could have consequences that you just don't want to know about because the whole transaction could be unraveled. And of course, you're subject to regulatory action, and it doesn't matter how innocent you were, you still run the risk of reputational damage. So let's have a look at the underpinnings of all of these types of fraud. First of all, we've got the criminal code. As I've said to you, fraud is a criminal offense. Then you've got the provisions of the Mortgage Brokers Act that apply to you, and that's currently, of course, soon, who knows when, we'll have the Mortgage Services Act. And you also are subject to the BC Business Practices and Consumer Protection Act. So let's look at the criminal code first. Fraud is defined in the code as hiding information or documents about title or a charge on the title. I'm talking specifically of mortgage fraud here. Misrepresenting information in order to obtain a mortgage, making false statements to persuade the registration of a title, and or selling a property while knowing that there is actually an unregistered prior sale or an unregistered prior charge. Your maximum penalty is an imprisonment for up to 14 years. And in some cases, so you'd have to be really, really bad to get the 14 years. But in some cases, there is a minimum imprisonment of 2 years. So you really want to be sure you're not committing any kind of fraud or doing anything that would even take you into the realm of fraud. Now we look at the Mortgage Brokers Act. you have requirements that say you cannot have false, misleading, or deceptive statements in advertising. Your Form 9 disclosure must be true, plain, and not misleading. And all of your conflict of interest disclosures must be true, plain, and not misleading. The penalty that the BCFSA can levy on you is $100,000 on the first offense. And if there's a second offense or others thereafter, $200,000 per offense. So for individuals, you can also get imprisonment of up to 2 years. So in all cases, it's not just your reputational damage. You could be subject to a monetary fine. You could even go to prison. Let's look at the Consumer Protection Act. In this act, it doesn't only apply to mortgage brokers, of course, it applies to all businesses. And here they talk about deceptive acts or practices and unconscionable acts or practices. The penalty here is $5,000, which seems very little compared to what I've just told you could be subject to. But in this one, there's a twist, because here you have to prove that you didn't engage in a deceptive or unconscionable act or practice. Whereas with the others, the onus is actually on the prosecutor in the case of criminal fraud, and on the claimant in a civil suit, the onus is on them. And of course, for the mortgage brokers, the FSA would actually have to prove that you did those things wrong. So let's have a look at what a deceptive act or practice is. It's misrepresentation about anything to do with a mortgage application. For example, your relationships or the history or the client's relationships or history, any information about the borrower, any information about the purpose and intent of the loan, and exaggerations or hints about a material fact to do with the mortgage application. An unconscionable act is something similar, because this is something you knew or ought to have known. And here you have to think about the particular situation. So remember I said your first client that Desmond introduced to you was an immigrant from South Korea. Well, maybe the borrower doesn't understand the language in the application or the loan agreement for that matter. Perhaps the price or the rate has been exaggerated, or the terms and conditions are unfair. Anything along those lines is an unconscionable act. Now, if the court finds that there is a deceptive or unconscionable act or practice, it's got various solutions that it can give to the aggrieved party. First of all, it can reopen the transaction and can exchange the amounts. So you could end up paying instead of receiving money. The court can relieve the borrower from the obligation to pay any more than the prime rate of interest. The court can set aside all or part of the loan and the mortgage, or it can suspend the rights and obligations of the parties, which has the same effect, basically, of canceling the transaction. Now, in all of these scenarios, what can you do to avoid this? And really, it comes down to one thing, although it's kind of split into two parts. You have to do your due diligence. And your due diligence must be reasonable. You've got the education to become a mortgage broker. So reasonable means that the ordinary mortgage broker with expertise and knowledge is going to be the standard. So you have to make absolutely sure that the information you forward to the lender is accurate and not misleading. For that information that you give, for that matter, information you give to the borrower as well. And you also have to make sure that the borrower knows that every item of information they include in the application must be true. Okay, so you have to tell them that. And once they've given you the application, you also have to look at it to make sure that the information sounds reasonable. So if we go back to our case, in the case of the immigrant from South Korea, working as a server at Taco Time, is she really earning $75,000 a year? Okay, so these are the things you have to look out for. So what should you do? Well, ask questions when the information doesn't make sense. Obtain documents or other evidence to verify information. And you heard Tony talk about the different service providers that are there to help you identify your clients. KYC is so important. Keep a written record of all of your communications with the borrower. You know, in these days of texts and telephone calls, it's easy enough to just keep a record. Trust your instinct. If something doesn't smell right, just ask more questions. And if you're unsure, ask a supervisor or a more experienced broker, or even approach the association and see if you can get help. And finally, take your time to make sure that all of the information you obtain and that you forward is accurate and not misleading. So there can be nothing ambiguous in your applications. What shouldn't you do? Well, of course, don't lie, because as soon as you do, you're there with a possibility of a fraud claim hanging over your head. Don't avoid asking questions just because you're not sure. You know, especially when you're starting out, you might feel a little bit embarrassed. You might feel this is something I should know and I don't. Well, that's the time that you really should ask more questions. Don't take instructions from a third party without checking the information from the borrower. So, for example, you might have somebody come in and say, well, you know, my client doesn't speak English, so she's asked me to speak on her behalf. So everything you want to know, just ask me and I will give you the answers. No, you can't do that. Don't be persuaded to let things slide, and especially don't be rushed. When somebody's pushing you and they're telling you it's urgent, we don't have time to get all of this information, that's the time you really need to slow down. So at the end of the day, what you need to know is you've got to exercise due diligence as a reasonable mortgage broker. You want to be sure that you're not getting yourself into any kind of trouble, particularly when it comes to fraud as a criminal offense, or even something less than that. Your obligations under BCFSA requirements are that you always conduct due diligence, that you don't make any claims that are misleading or that are not accurate. So I hope that gives you some kind of a parameter to actually work towards. And then we'll find out in a minute from Jeff about how you can further protect yourself.
Thank you so much, Veronica. I appreciated that. That was a lot of great material in there. You can see that the expectation is that you have to do your due diligence. And there's a couple of questions. So thank you for those that have put the questions in. So I wanted to direct this to Tony and Veronica in case they have an answer. So I'll go through. The first one isn't for Tony and Veronica, but it'll just say, is this recorded presentation being made available? Yes, it will be made available on the site for members. So once the session is over, it will be uploaded and available for you to review afterwards if you are a member of CMBA-BC. The questions that we've got here, one of them is, many people have legal names and a new English name used in Canada. Often their credit bureaus are showing multiple names. Do we need to pull more credit bureau reports to comply with due diligence verification? I'll pass it over to Veronica and Tony to see if they have an answer, and then I can throw in some stuff as well.
Well,
I'll let Tony go first.
Okay, I'll take the first crack. I mean, the answer is 100% maybe. I think that in and of itself is okay, but you have to look at the totality of the file. So if there's anything else involved, I would err on the side of caution. It's like when someone asks, do I need to disclose something? Just disclose. Get yourself out of the woods, get your client out of trouble. So yeah, if there's any kind of issue whatsoever, I would pull more credit bureaus, and I would document that, and I would I would e-paper the file, so it shows that you've completed your due diligence. I would have a checklist on every single file. Am I dealing with the client? Are they speaking English? Do they have a job? Does their salary match up with their job? Whatever that checklist is, and I don't know if CMBA-BC has that or if other more senior brokers have that. And I would go through that checklist on every file to make sure that you've done your due diligence and you've complied with the reasonable standard that's imposed upon all of us in our professions.
Thanks, Tony. I'll speak to it a little from the anti-money laundering point of view. And don't forget, these are obligations that you will be subject to come October. And there are 5 different verification methods that you can use for individuals. But let's talk about the 3 that are the most common. The first is government issued ID. So what you will be doing is actually verifying a client by their government issued ID. And once you are able to do that, and of course you would do this in person if they are in person with you, you have to make sure that the government issued ID is current, valid, and authentic. Now, if you're meeting remotely, then you actually need a service provider to help you with authentication technology. But in all cases, the government issued ID has to be valid, current, and authentic. If you're using the credit file, then you obviously would need all of the names that they could possibly have the credit file under, as Tony has just said. And if you're using the dual process method, that means you need 2 pieces of information that are from a reliable source and that are authentic. Now, if you get 2 pieces of information and they've got different names, that's not going to be good enough. You're going to have to check and verify that all of the names refer to the same people. So it is always best to do as much as you can, as Tony has said, when there are multiple names, to verify under all of those multiple names.
Thank you, Veronica. Tony, that's fabulous. There are a couple other questions. What I'll do is I'll go through my piece of the presentation and then get to the next 2, because I think some of it may come up as well. So if what we'll do is we'll talk a little bit about my experience with the frauds that we've seen from First Canadian Title's lens. So, we talk about why should brokers care, and I think on the next slide it'll talk about why you should care. So what we're looking at here is fraud is on the rise. We're seeing a significant increase. Both Veronica and Tony spoke about what we're seeing and how the sophistication is continuing. I often use this when I talk about fraud. I used to work at a credit union, and we used to have get fake $100 bills, and they started to rely on the tellers to review the $100 bills. But as the sophistication increased, you couldn't rely just on the eye anymore. They had to introduce technology that would be able to identify a fake or a counterfeit. So that's what we're seeing now. And it was mentioned by both Veronica and Tony that they're becoming more sophisticated. So you need to be aware of that. So why do brokers care, or why should brokers care? It is for reasons like that. We're also seeing, and we used to see fraud in certain areas of, Toronto and Vancouver, but we're starting to see it in some of the smaller centers. I've got a specific example where there was a fraud for $250,000 in Southwest Alberta in a small town that you would never think would be hit with fraud, but we're starting to see that. They're not just relying on the bigger centers now. So from a broker's point of view, you think, well, I'm not lending in Vancouver or Toronto or Calgary or Edmonton, but it does happen in some of the smaller centers across the country. We're seeing fraud in the free and clear properties, those that don't necessarily have any mortgages on it, so there's no need for them to really monitor that. So that's another piece that we're seeing. Veronica and Tony both spoke about a couple of these as well. The regulatory changes that are coming. There is more onus on the brokers to do that due diligence. The burden of proof. Veronica mentioned the penalty times. You're seeing incremental increasing in fines and potential jail time possible. This isn't to put the fear into you, but it's really to make you aware that there is an expectation from a broker to make sure that they do their due diligence. We're also seeing a lot of times, and this is coming from a title insurance perspective, that there's underwriting requirements that are being continually pushed forward, and the lenders are starting to push back when they're not getting the proper documentation. If they're getting documentation that seems a little bit suspect, to Veronica's point, a server at Taco Time making 75,000, is that really legitimate? So it is the onus on the broker to really take a look at it and not just force feed the documents in and say, okay, my part is done. There is that expectation. So why should brokers care? It's reputational, as it was mentioned previously, that we're seeing fraud. There is targeting of certain situations and certain type of frauds that are coming forward. So you just have to do all that you can to ensure that you're doing what's right for your customer and your brand. When we talk about this, we've seen a significant increase in real estate fraud. 62 more claims opened in just a year. We don't have the statistics yet for 2024, but I can tell you that for the first half of the year, the claims that I've been seeing, we're on pace to see this exceeded as well. So when you see that we saw over a course of 1 year, 62% increase in fraud claims open, that should spark an interest in you as to why. Well, what's the concern? Is this becoming a bigger issue? Tony mentioned it as well, the mix in the private lender fraud claims, 94% increases over the institutional lenders, banks, monolines. So it really is a situation where we're seeing an increase in fraud claims from those areas. That is not to say that they're rampant with it. It's just that we wanted to see some more due diligence done with those. And as both Tony and Veronica mentioned, there is more time taken with those private lender deals in the mix. They're looking at them to do a little bit more investigation. The last piece is something that's very important as well. When you take a look at over the last 5 years, a 416% increase in more suspicious transactions identified. That is something that's significant. And what you can see is what we've identified on the number itself on the next slide is really around how much fraud has been identified. This doesn't mean that it was over $500 million in fraud, but it's suspicious transactions identified. And when we do that, we flag it. We come back to the lawyer, the notary, or the borrower, the lender, and have a conversation. And some of them have just been identified through the red flags that we've talked about, things that we look for, and how you've seen that increase. That's a big number. And I can tell you that over the course of the years, we've seen that continually rise as well. This is just a quick example. We've already gone through and Tony talked about it, but this is an example of a fraudulent mortgage. I'm not going to go through all the details because we're hitting almost 10:15 and I want to make sure we get to some of the questions that we have online. But it really is around a purchaser with an investment property received the notice that their mortgage was in default. They knew or they felt that it wasn't. But what ended up happening is they found out that the title was fraudulently transferred from the insured homeowner. And I'm not going to say this is a standard, but if you have a renter in a home that you've got, and what ends up happening is they could get a piece of mail in the actual owner's name that comes to the house, and if they're part of a fraud ring, they could use that information. As Tony said, it's very simple to get an ID set up and move forward. But those are the things that happen here. Is that you can see that you think that everything's okay with your investment property, that the mortgage was going along fine, but you could see that it was fraudulently transferred. There was a $165,000 mortgage that was registered on title, and obviously the fraudulent transferee was nowhere to be found. So to try and get remediation from that is tough. I won't go over the fact that what FCT did. So it's just that title insurance is definitely can help both the lender and the borrower or the homeowner that has a home in good standing. So we've talked about this and Veronica touched on it as well. Some of the best practices that we often provide to say for brokers and is to have, do you know your referral source? Do you know who the individual is? Veronica mentioned if you're getting a quick emergency rush deal that you don't know the people, you need to take your time to find out who they are. Do you know the client? Do you know the client yourself, or is there a way that you can validate or verify that client? Dealing with the elderly, there's so much concern right now about elder abuse and the pushing forward of forcing elderly individuals to get a mortgage on their property. We see a lot of this in Ontario as well, with the notice of security interest that has been changed there. But again, dealing with the elderly, if you're dealing with them, find out who they, why they need this mortgage, and push a little bit harder. And I know in my conversations with a lot of brokers that I deal with, they do have these great conversations. The other piece is, we often suggest interview the borrower alone to make sure there's no coercion, to make sure they're not being forced into this, and they understand that they're completely responsible. There is the independent legal advice route as well that is very important as well. That is something that we're seeing lenders take on more as well, to get that independent legal advice to confirm if the borrower is aware of it. Is this product right for the client that you're doing? Is it somebody, does it make sense for a 30-year-old to be going into a certain product type? Making sure that you understand, does it make sense and line up with where they are in their life cycle? Brokers' files are more investigated. Brokers' files are definitely in a situation that there is scrutiny put on it. Not more scrutiny, but as I say, the due diligence is required. And lastly, if you can do it, use the borrower's own lawyer. We talked about ID verification, but it really is, some of the things that we talk about is, does the borrower or does the lawyer know the borrower? That creates, Tony's shaking his head. So there you go. Did you want to add something to that, Tony?
Well, yeah, not to jump in here, but we oftentimes with some of the larger mix, we treat them as institutional lenders. We act for both sides in that transaction. It speeds up the transaction. We give them independent advice. We verify their identification. I know one of the questions we're going to deal with is why don't the lawyers do it? We do, but it shouldn't even, by the time we do it, it's the day of funding or day before. So the broker should do that beforehand. So I don't necessarily agree with you on that point, Jeff. I didn't see that on the slide deck earlier. We probably could have chatted beforehand offline. No need to have a dispute in front of 95 attendees, but I'll take a contrary position on that one.
That's perfect, Tony, and I love it, because I think that's what we want to do here. Is this is the information that I've got, but I absolutely love your point of view, and I think you're right. If you act up for both sides, it's just about that independent legal advice that's taken. Great point, Tony. Thank you.
Thank you.
And this speaks to what Tony was talking about as well, and Veronica both. Sometimes we get the requests about getting this deal done, and we're talking about ID verification is becoming more prevalent and necessity. Veronica talked about that as a requirement now. Tony talked about these deals that are getting rushed through, but there's a requirement of due diligence. Our red flags will come into place if we see the rush transactions, if we see the funds going to a third party with no evidence of that debt that can be substantiated. So when you're looking at these files from a broker lens, make sure that you understand that it's going to take some more time between the requirement for ID verification and some of the investigative questions that are asked on for you. That's something that we often look at. And as I mentioned here, we're looking at elderly borrowers with no mortgage on title. What is the purpose of it? Are they aware of what they're getting themselves into? And it's important to have the conversations with the lawyers to ensure that they know what they're getting themselves into. Again, the borrower purportedly resides at the property, but ID doesn't associate with this. And client is overseas and the property is being done by way of a POA. It doesn't mean that these are fraudulent. It just means that there's sometimes some additional investigation that needs to be done that can create frustration for you and for the borrower, because we need to do a little bit more investigation, and that's the requirement from our end. So what we're going to go through now is a few of the questions that we've got here. So I'm hoping Tony and Veronica can speak to a couple of these as well. So it says, if an international student decides to buy a place he or she is renting, the down payment is from the parents that live overseas. The purchase is in the student's name. How much full verification or due diligence is required to be done by the broker for the lender? Is that a question that we can answer?
I don't think I'm able. Crack at it.
Go ahead, Veronica. Yeah.
Okay. All right. So of course, it's reasonable due diligence we're talking about. It's not going beyond. You do need to know the source of funds. So if there is evidence to support that the funds are coming from the parents who live overseas, then that is fine. If there's no evidence to support that, or somehow you get the evidence shows that the money's gone, let's just take an example. It's gone from China to Hong Kong to the Cayman Islands, and then it comes into Canada. There's going to be a problem with that. Usually, you won't know that. Usually, the funds are going to be coming from a Canadian chartered bank. And if that is the case, then you can probably accept that unless you have information or you have some kind of a doubt or suspicion. But if it's coming from a Canadian chartered bank, they have their own due diligence requirements, and they have to also ask for the source of funds. So as long as you're doing something reasonable, and always document everything. Okay, so that's the answer that I can give there.
Thank you,
I
Veronica.
don't have a lot to add to that. Lawyers have a duty to investigate source of funds as well, and we have a duty to ask the client and to make sure that the story fits. But again, if it comes from a Canadian bank, we're a lot more likely to accept those funds than if it comes from an international bank. Usually an international bank, once we tell them that if we receive money from an international bank, those funds are tied up for 30 to 60 days, they tend to go away. So that's probably a fraudulent transaction there to begin with.
Thank you, Veronica and Tony. Great answer. Got a couple more, and we've got a couple minutes, so we'll try to go through these. What is the solution if the client doesn't speak English and he or she authorized a friend or family member to speak on their behalf?
I would say, and this happens with me with some of my clients who don't have English as a fluent language. If they have somebody with them, just make sure that the person who is your client is actually in the room at the same time. If at all possible, get somebody on your side who speaks that language so that you know that the questions and answers are actually matching. If you can't have somebody on your side to verify that conversation, then watch the interaction between your client and the translator. You know, if the borrower is giving a very, very long answer and the translation is 3 words long, then be careful.
And I think in addition to that, look at the totality of the file. If everything else looks okay, smells okay, feels okay, then this on itself, I don't think is enough to indicate fraud. But if it's a rush file, a private transaction, there's a recent discharge, then I think you need to either bring in a translator or at the very least have someone in there who can speak the language at least partially to understand the dialogue between the two and to look at their interaction, as Veronica says.
Excellent. Thank you both for those answers. That's fabulous. One of the other one that's in here says builders are usually a group of investors and more frequent change of the investors. How far in search of the search history of the investors is needed to send to the lawyer?
Well, I think it's to the lender, Jeff, and really that's going to depend on the lender. Once we get the instructions, we verify the ID and source of funds and that stuff. But in terms of appeasing the lender, that I assume would be up to each individual lender.
Yeah, I agree, Tony. I think I think the idea is that for your due diligence, it'll require or be required, the lender will determine how far back to go. I think it's just a matter of follow what the lender states.
Yeah, I think if you're arranging financing for a builder, that's a whole different scenario. That's almost a commercial mortgage with much more due diligence. There's going to be a lot more documentation required, a lot more ID verification. So I think that's a little outside the realm of what we've discussed today. Certainly a lot of it does overlap, but that's a much more complicated file.
Great answer. Thank you, Tony. You've answered those type of questions before, haven't you? One of the questions that we have here, or a couple of the questions are around ID verification, and we want to remind individuals, as we stated at the beginning, that we do have Treefort as a service provider with CMBA-BC. There is a link on our site for Treefort to have access to that. So please visit the CMBA-BC website to access Treefort. One of the questions here is Treefort IDV is voluntary. And I think that Veronica and Tony, if you wanted to answer that, I think I can provide an answer as well. Is it's dependent on the institution that requires it. And from a title insurance perspective, it's based on the file. Sometimes we will require ID based on some of the flags that we see or some of the history that we have. So from a title insurance provider, it's not always voluntary. It depends on each specific file. And then I'll hand it over to Tony and Veronica to answer that as well.
Well, I'm speaking on behalf of some of the mix that we represent. Some of those have taken the position that they want it on every file. Others have more of a checklist type approach. You know, it's this file, but not that file. So it will depend on the lender.
I would just remind everybody again that anti-money laundering requirements are coming into force in October for the mortgage industry, which means that everybody's going to have to do ID verification. How you choose to do it is up to you. Using third-party service providers can actually prevent a lot of hard work on your part. And then you also are able to say that you've exercised reasonable due diligence in choosing your provider and in relying on the information that they gave you. It might be some way to get you off the hook a little bit, but you can certainly do your ID verification yourself, but just bear in mind now it is going to be mandatory. There was a question, I believe, about asking lawyers to do that. Well, lawyers have their own client identification requirements, as Tony has pointed out. You can ask the lawyer who's doing the ID verification to verify on your behalf. However, you need to have the agreement in place before the transaction takes place. And so that is going to be very inconvenient because, as Tony said, you know, sometimes they're only meeting the borrower for the first time that day. It's too late for you to get your agent agreement in place before. So that might not always work, but just because the lawyer has done ID verification does not mean that you can rely on it. You can only rely on it if you have the agreement in place beforehand and they give you a confirmation afterwards that this is the method of ID that they've used to verify and that you are able to rely on it. So it's going to get a lot more complicated come October.
Great points. Thank you very much, Veronica and Tony. We've got about 2 minutes left. I think there's one other question that we can answer here. Zoom identification or Zoom ID verification is becoming popular. Is it still accepted to use this method?
You can use Zoom ID if you have technology to verify the document. So in other words, I hold up my ID. Well, that's my credit card, but I hold up my ID and you look at the ID and you look at me to see whether they match. That's not good enough. You actually need technology to verify the piece of ID. So that's where people like Treefort, CanCheck, Yoti, there are a whole bunch of ID verification services out there, but make use of the one that CMBA actually has, which is Treefort.
Thank you, Veronica. I really do want to thank both of you for the great insight on today's webinar. I think that we talked about white collar crime and what's happening there, and I think it's becoming more prevalent and it doesn't seem to have a lot of things that are done with it. I really do appreciate the time taken today, especially during your busy times. I would really like to thank our sponsors again, VWR Capital, Terranet, and ProLink. And thanks to everybody for taking their time out to attend. Don't forget about the survey and the feedback. Please ensure that you take your time to do that. And I hope you all have a wonderful day and enjoy the session today. Thank you.